Hey guys, Mr. Backerberg here. This is part 1 of lesson 1.3. We're going to use the midpoint formula to help us find some lengths of segments in the coordinate plane. So the word midpoint kind of implies what's happening. A midpoint is a point in the middle of a segment. And what happens with a midpoint is it splits the segment in half. So we would say that the midpoint of a segment divides that segment into two congruent segments. And remember, that word congruent means exactly the same size. So if we're looking at this picture up above, let's say that point B is our midpoint. Then the length that goes from A to B is exactly the same size as the length that goes from B to C. Now, visually, the way we show that a couple of segments are congruent is we're going to put a slash mark on them. So from A to B, we're going to put one slash mark there, and from B to C, we're going to put one slash mark there. So that's just telling us that this segment on the left is exactly the same size as this segment on the right. Looking at this example, it says that point M is the midpoint of the segment VW, and we want to figure out how long the segment is that goes from V to M. And we're given some algebraic expressions which we're going to use to help us out. Now, M is the midpoint. We've already got our congruence markings on our segment. So based on this, we know that VM is going to be congruent to MW. And with these algebraic expressions, those are representing the length of each segment. Now remember, segments are congruent, but their measures are equal. So what that's saying is the 4x minus 1, which goes with the VM, is going to be equal to the 3x plus 3, which represents the MW length. And now what we're going to do is just a little bit of algebra solving. We want to get our x values on one side and our numbers on the other side. So what I'm going to do with this 3x is subtract it over to the left-hand side. If we take 4x minus 3x, we've got just a plain x left over, and then those 3x's will cancel out on the right-hand side. We've still got this minus 1, and this is going to equal 3. Now, in order to get x all by itself, we'll have to add this 1 over to the right-hand side, so that'll cancel out, and we'll get x equals 4. But we're not quite done. It said that we wanted to figure out how long it is from V to M. We know what our x value is, so we're going to take this 4 and go up to that VM length and plug the 4 in. So we'll take 4 times that x value of 4, and then we'll have to subtract off 1. Well, 4 times 4 is 16, and if we subtract 1 from that, we get 15 as the length from V to M. Let's say we're looking at a segment that's out on a coordinate plane, an x and y plane, and it has endpoints of point A and point B. And let's say we want to figure out where the midpoint of this segment is. Now, when we're talking about all of these points, they have ordered pairs associated with them, x values and y values. For this point A, we don't know where that's located, so I'm just going to give it a general ordered pair. I'm going to call the x value x1, and I'm going to call the y value y1. Now, for point B, I'm going to give that a general location as well, but this is going to be x2 and y2. Now, if we're trying to find the location of this midpoint, I'm going to call that point M, then there's a little bit of a formula that we can use. So what we're going to do in order to find that midpoint is we're going to be building another ordered pair using the values that were given to us for point A and point B. Now, when we're building the x value for this new ordered pair, we're going to be focusing on the x values that we were given. So we had an x value of x1, and we had an x value of x2. So what we're going to do is we're going to add those things together, but then we're going to divide it by 2. So what we're doing is we're averaging these two x values. We're finding the middle value between these two x values. Now, when we're finding the y value for this midpoint, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take that y1 value, we're going to add on that y2 value, and then we're going to divide that by 2 as well. Again, we're averaging those y values. So this little formula right here is what we'll use to find our midpoint if we're dealing with a segment whose endpoints are somewhere out on a coordinate grid. So we've got a few examples where we are given the endpoints of a segment, and we're going to run through and find the midpoint of that segment. So in part A here, the first point we've got is -1, -2, and then we've got the point 3, -4. So we're going to run through and find the midpoint using that midpoint formula that we just talked about on the last page. I'll go ahead and write it down. It's x1 plus x2 over 2 and y1 plus y2 over 2. That'll be our midpoint. So as we're looking at this, the first thing I would do is I would label my ordered pairs. This first one over here on the left-hand side, the -1, -2, I'm going to call my x1 and my y1 point. Our other point is going to be the x2 and the y2, and then all we have to do is take the values we've got and plug them into this midpoint formula. So our x1 value is -1, plus our x2 value is 3. We're going to divide that by 2. And then our y1 value is -2, plus our y2 value, which is -4. And then we're going to divide that by 2. Now there is some simplifying that we can do here. If we take -1 plus 3 on top of that first fraction, we're going to get 2. So we've got 2 divided by 2. And then with this other fraction, -2 plus -4 is -6. Over 2, and then we can reduce these fractions down. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and -6 divided by 2 is -3. So the midpoint of this segment is the point 1, -3. Taking a look at our next example, we've got the point -3, -1, and we've also got the point 7, -5. Just like I did on the last one, I'm going to label these ordered pairs. So x1, y1, x2 and y2, and then let's just start plugging them into our midpoint formula. So -3 plus 7 divided by 2 and -1 plus -5 divided by 2. So if we start simplifying this down, -3 plus 7 is 4 divided by 2, and then -1 plus -5 is -6 divided by 2. And then last thing, let's simplify our fractions. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and -6 divided by 2 is -3. So there we get the midpoint 2, -3. Now with this last one, why don't you go ahead and pause the video, run through it on your own, and then start it back up when you're finished. So just like I did with the last two examples, I am going to first label my ordered pairs so I know which values are which from our points. Then let's start plugging them into our formula. So I'm going to go 4 plus 2 divided by 2 and 3 plus -3 divided by 2. So for the x value we get 6 over 2, and for the y value we get 0 over 2. Well, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 0 divided by 2 is 0. So we get the ordered pair 3, 0 as our midpoint. This last example is going to be a little bit different. This time we have the coordinates for one of the endpoints, and we have the coordinates for the midpoint, and we want to find the location of the other endpoint. We're still going to use our midpoint formula, but we're going to treat it just a little bit differently. What we did when we were finding the x value for the midpoint is we took x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and that gave us a brand new x value for the midpoint. I'm going to call that x sub m, the x value for the midpoint. Then we dealt with the y values. We took y1 plus y2 divided by 2, and that gave us a new y value for the midpoint, which I'm going to call y sub m. We're going to use these two separate formulas to help us find our other endpoint. With this first m point, I'm going to call that my x1, y1 point, and for this midpoint, I'm going to call that my xm and my ym, since it's the midpoint. Now I'm going to start with this formula on the left-hand side, dealing with the x values. We know what our x1 value is, so we can just plug that value in, but we don't know what our x2 value is, so I'm just going to leave that alone. We don't have a value to plug in there. We've still got this divided by 2, and this equals our xm value, which is the -2 from the midpoint. Now if we go through and solve this, first thing I see is this divided by 2 on the left-hand side. So in order to get rid of divided by 2, we're going to have to multiply both sides by 2. On the left-hand side, those 2's will cancel out, so we'll have -5 plus x2 equals -2 times 2 is -4. Last thing, in order to get that x2 value all by itself, is we're going to add this 5 over to the right hand side. So this missing x2 value that we were looking for is 1. Now I'm going to start building this ordered pair. We know the x2 value is 1. Now let's run through and find our y value using this other formula. We know that our y1 value is 0 plus this unknown y2 value divided by 2 equals our y sub m value, which is 7. Now on the top here, taking 0 plus y2, well, if we take y2 and add 0 to it, that's not going to change the value at all. So it's just y2 divided by 2 equals 7. Again, in order to get rid of this divided by 2, we're going to multiply both sides by 2. Left-hand side, those 2's will cancel out, so we'll get y2 equals 14. And I'm going to fill that in on my ordered pair. So the location of that other endpoint is the point 1, 14. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching.